I remember we moved to Pearl, we had a shower, like 2 showers. And I thought we had become like rich because we had a shower.
This is Justin Sledge, a child of the 80s. He lived in Jackson, Mississippi until the early 90s, when his family moved to a small town called Pearl.
Yeah, my parents would let us just roam around. We would cut grass to make money, and we would have $20 in our pocket, which was an enormous amount of money, I think. And, we could walk down to the Taco Bell and buy our own food, and then walk to the video store and then rent, Evil Dead and some Super Nintendo game. And yeah, we had an enormous amount of freedom and, independence.
Every generation runs the risk of becoming really annoying by acting like they were better at being kids. But it is striking how someone born in the 80s, the early 80s like Justin or the late 80s like me, remembers the world being completely different than it is today. We remember what it was like to not have a cell phone, to not have a way to contact your parents as a child, to wonder about something and then just kind of have no way of finding out. I feel nostalgia for a time I didn't even experience when I listened to Justin. And this is a nostalgia so many people, especially millennials, feel these days.
In many ways, it was a pretty good upbringing. I look back on my childhood with a lot of joy, either the more working class time we lived in South Jackson and also the time that we lived in Pearl.
When Justin was 16, something happened in the town of Pearl, Mississippi, that made all that joy and all that safety disappear.
I was working at an amusement park that had go-karts and laser tag and ice skating, which is a strange thing to talk about, ice skating in Mississippi, but there was an ice rink there. You wouldn't know it from the beard I have now, but I have a huge scar on my chin from just a few weeks before that, where I got cut off and fell on the ice and landed chin first on the ice and busted my chin open rather badly. And I think you can even see the scar in some of the mugshots that they took during that whole time period. There's sort of pieces of things that I remember. It all seemed to it's like standing in front of a freight train or something.
In 1997, Pearl, Mississippi was the site of a horrific crime, and Justin found himself in the middle of it.
You could start hearing the first rumors of conspiracy. There were several different iterations of what this conspiracy was. The first version of it was that this was somehow wrapped up in the mafia. And then the next iteration I heard was that there was some group of people at the school called The Group, maybe tied to devil worship.
This story is almost unbearably familiar now. We, as a culture, a small town, or a country, are confronted with a crime that reveals something terrifying about the people we spend our lives with. And so we search for an outsider to blame it on. And there's no better outsider than Satan. But the Prince of Darkness never works alone. Apparently, he hires a lot of teenagers to help him take over the world.
Yeah, it was sometime in the evening time when the police came. Yeah, I remember coming out of my room and they turned me around and handcuffed me and told me I was charged with a conspiracy to commit murder.
The panic began in the 1980s with fears about terrible things happening to very young children. As the 80s became the 90s, and as these children grew up, so did the panic. And in many places, the focus shifted from saving the children to blaming the teenagers. What is it like to grow up in a world where you are seen as both potential victim and potential suspect? What does the Satanic Panic allow those in power to ignore? And why does taking on Satan himself so often lead the powerful to blame the powerless? I'm Sarah Marshall. This is The Devil You Know. Everywhere they turned, kids in the 1980s were told to just say no.
This is your brain on drugs.
This is crack, rock cocaine. It isn't glamorous or cool or kid stuff.
McGruff here. I want you to learn a song that tells people to say no to drugs. Users are losers and losers are users, so don't use drugs. Down.
There is something very 80s in the best and the worst way about using the powers of He-Man and She-Ra to teach children how to protect themselves and stay safe.
She-Ra and I want to talk to you about something that's very personal, your body.
Remember, it's your body and no one should touch you in a way that you feel is wrong. Right, Orko? Right
on! This was the era of the latchkey kid. More than ever before, both fathers and mothers were working long hours to support children they didn't see that often.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
There's something especially ironic about the fact that we feel so much nostalgia today, both in Facebook memes and conversations and the way pop culture has turned in huge mass media franchises like Stranger Things, for this vanished era of a child who could roam free, ride their bike around the streets, adopt an alien, whatever they needed to do as long as they were home by 7. And to feel nostalgic for that while forgetting that the reason we stopped allowing kids to do that was because we created the panic that took that childhood away. And then adolescence comes. Suddenly, everyone is both terrified for you and terrified of you. If there's anything I remember about being a youth, it's that telling us not to do something only makes that forbidden fruit look 10 times more tempting. And besides, there's nothing more fun than scaring gullible adults. The evangelical Christian show, The 700 Club, blamed MTV for a lot of teenage rebellion.
Occultic symbols abound in MTV. In King Diamond's Welcome Home, the singer floats in the air more demon than man. Madonna sings in front of burning crosses. Nuclear assaults, demonic faces. The looks are violent, frightening.
It wasn't just TV preachers that were worried about Satan. The secular crowd had plenty of concerns, too. School officials, psychologists, and others at the time said that so-called satanic cults could offer validation, support, and direction to teens experiencing feelings of alienation and antisocial attitudes. In 1989, the newsletter for the National Association of School Psychologists warned,
often teenagers are influenced by heavy metal groups, ready access to drugs, and sexual activities. There's evidence that this is widespread among teenagers in today's culture.
Still others said Satanism was a symptom of a larger problem in a teen's life, or merely faddish symbols of teenage rebellion.
Intermittent symptoms of learning disabilities, evidencing reversal of letters and numbers, i.e. backwards writing, themes of death and killing in artwork, excessive use of black, red, and purple in art illustrations, destructive behavior with children, toys, cruelty to animals, sleep problems, i.e. night terrors, preoccupation with monsters, scary books, and movies.
But even with these slightly kinder and more level-headed interpretations from adults, there seemed to be no escaping the association of deviant teens with Satanism. Remember our friend Dr. Lawrence Pazder from episode 2? Here's what he had to say about teen Satan worship in 1989.
Adolescents try everything out. You want to try it out and see what it does to you, to get a high from it or not. Start putting a few candles up and start putting some posters up and start invoking the devil to see what's going to happen, and you get caught up in it.
That's not to say there was no such thing as a self-identified teen Satanist. The CBC managed to find some in 1989.
Raymond is 18, lives in the Okanagan Valley town of Vernon, and worships Satan. It's kids like Raymond that doctors and counselors fear for most. Kids who get entranced with the idea of celebrating evil and who turn away from the regular world. To Raymond, Christianity is evil and corrupt.
Well, Satanism is down to earth. It's what you are. I mean, there's none of the spiritual jargon mixed in. There's none of this saying, if you do this, you're going to burn in a lake of fire.
So, how do you identify a teenage Satanist?
We moved to Pearl at the very beginning of 6th grade.
Here's Justin Sledge again from earlier.
Middle school's a difficult time. It's like when people are coming to understand who they are. It's when class differences and cliques begin to emerge. It's when the kind of backpack you wear and what kind of clothes you wear begin to matter. That was a little bit of a learning curve, I would say. You know, there were definitely bullies, and there was definitely the in and out crowd and that kind of thing. You know, there are certain styles that you either are an alternative kid, or you're a jock kid, or you're a preppy kid, or you're a goth kid, and you need to pick an appropriate uniform. If you don't pick an appropriate uniform, you're just sort of out on the edge of things.
Every teen is a deviant teen when you get right down to it, because what is being a teenager but experimenting and pushing boundaries, figuring out who you are by figuring out what you're not? That was what Justin was doing. He had interests that some might consider niche, like learning Latin and reading philosophy. And his family was Jewish, in a state where that was increasingly uncommon.
I only discovered I was of Jewish origin when I was like 12. My mom sat me down and said, "So you're Jewish, and I'm taking you to the synagogue, and you're going to meet with the rabbi, and he's going to sort you out." And so she took me to the synagogue, and the rabbi sorted me out. So I did get interested in Judaism and reading Hebrew, and there was something fascinating about the idea of learning the Bible in the original language and stuff like that. And I think it was also part of my disaffectedness with, you know, like the same thing that made me like listen to Rage Against the Machine was also like part of why I was interested in like being Jewish, you know, like kind of a rebellion against Christian hegemony or something. I don't know. You know, when you're a teenager, you want to rebel, and rebelling against Christianity was one way to do it. And I suppose the way I chose to do it was becoming Jewish, which is a strange form of rebellion.
Another thing Justin was into was Dungeons and Dragons.
I definitely found friends. I had lots of friends. You know, we had our own hobbies that we did. We did martial arts or played Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that.
Unfortunately for Justin, if you're trying to build a profile of a teen Satanist in the 80s, this is strike one.
Millions of children and teenagers now play Dungeons and Dragons. They are drawn to the adventure, fantasy, and suspense the game creates through mythical characters and complex situations.
In the early 80s, there were two highly publicized cases of two different teenagers who both loved D&D and who both died by suicide. Their parents and the PIs they hired blamed Dungeons and Dragons for their deaths.
Hat Pulling formed a group called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Along with the National Coalition of Television Violence in the States, BAD documents 28 cases of juvenile murder and suicide they claim are linked to D&D.
Adults in the 80s, so confident in their own grasp of reality, didn't trust teenagers to be able to tell the difference between fantasy and real life. Which brings us back to Justin Sledge. After all, D&D is only one part of what sounds like a pretty rich teenage social life.
I got pretty interested in like alternative music, and there was one radio channel in our town that at like 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night, they would play alternative music. And so I got pretty into alternative music, you know, the sort of standard grungy music of the mid to late 90s. So I started dressing in that style, and that put me into the sort of skateboarder kids and the sort of long hair and the ironic shirt and the Jinko pants and all that stuff.
Strike two. That kind of music was a major red flag at the time. According to the experts, grunge, alt-punk, heavy metal, whatever, if the music had loud guitars, aggressive voices, and anti-authority lyrics, if it slapped, in other words, that meant Satan was as good as in the recording studio. Twisted Sister, Led Zeppelin, Ozzy Osbourne, and Judas Priest were some of the most high-profile targets of this branch of the Satanic Panic. For some, Satan's influence in the entertainment world seemed even more insidious.
Now that sounds pretty blatant, doesn't it? In one way or another, Greenwald argues, most of the popular rock groups are, consciously or not, working for Satan. Groups like Kiss, the Electric Light Orchestra, even Olivia Newton-John.
So here we have Justin growing up in the 80s and 90s, exercising his right to be a teenager, staying out past dark, wandering in the woods, playing Dungeons and Dragons, learning about his Jewish roots, reading old books and dead languages, and listening to hard rock music.
I wasn't a goth. I didn't wear trench coats. I didn't listen to Marilyn Manson. I was ice skating and playing Dungeons and Dragons and, listening to Nine Inch Nails or whatever.
At this point, he was an edgy teenager, or a dorky one, depending on your perspective. Maybe he was ticking some aesthetic boxes for being a teen Satanist, but none of the really concerning ones that school psychologists were being told to look out for. Either way, Justin was about to find himself with 3 strikes.
The Satanic Panic very nearly destroyed my life.
On a fall day in 1997, Justin was at school. It was still morning, and a kid he knew, named Luke, walked over to him.
The weather was beautiful that day. In fact, that was one of the things that sort of keyed me off that day, that something had gone very much awry. Was he showed up to school in a big blue, it was a heavy coat. He was wearing a coat. It's like a winter coat, big blue coat.
His classmate handed him a stack of papers.
And one of them really clearly was a will, and I could see clearly the word murder and kill on it. He had killed his mother that morning. And he basically told me to run, and he opened fired.
A 16-year-old student named Luke Woodham entered the school around 8 a.m. on October 1st. He had killed his mother, Mary, that morning, stabbing her to death at home before coming to school. He wounded 7 people and killed 2 students, Lydia Dew and Christina Menifee.
The sound of sirens and sobs of distress filled the air in Pearl Wednesday morning. Moments after the shooting, law enforcement officers converged on the campus to find frightened, weeping students. Parents rushed to the school.
That was coverage from the local news station WLBT the day of the shooting. This was one of America's first modern-day school shootings, 18 months before Columbine in 1999. Looking at this footage from the day of, it's hard to fully realize the kind of shock that everyone must have been in. It's like looking into a completely different world where this kind of violence actually was unfathomable. Dozens of school shootings have happened every year in the United States since the year 2000, and each one is in a way more devastating than the last, because we know at this point that it won't be the last. But that's a different kind of shock than being one of the first. There's just no way to make sense of something like this, especially in the immediate aftermath. But that didn't stop Justin from trying. He was one of the last people Luke Woodham spoke to before opening fire. And in the days following the shooting, Justin made some questionable choices.
Luke gave me his documents. He gave these documents to me and told me to pass them on to Grant Boyette. And I didn't. I passed them on to the media, which was also, I think, unwise.
Justin took a copy of these papers to the local TV station, WLBT, and gave an interview.
Justin Sledge was a classmate of Luke Woodham. He has known him since 6th grade. He says the picture the media and police have painted of Woodham is untrue. Woodham gave Sledge his credo, or a statement of belief that Sledge believes he wrote after he killed his mother. In an exclusive interview, he read some of it to us Wednesday night.
He begins, I am not insane. I would like to repeat that again. I am not insane. I am angry.
When the police chief did address Woodham's manifesto publicly, he dismissed it as, quote, a disgruntled boyfriend-girlfriend thing. His manifesto was that he was wronged.
I killed because people like me are mistreated every day. I do this to show society, push us, and we will push back.
Whether or not to release a mass shooter's so-called manifesto is, unfortunately, an ongoing public debate to this day, though typically it's police departments and media outlets who make that decision, not a traumatized teenager. But in the wake of tragedy, people search for meaning. Justin was doing that too.
Justin Sledge tells us no one can justify or condone what Luke Woodham has done. Buddy says everyone needs to know the truth, that Luke Woodham felt he would never make national news for being smart, but he did for being a killer.
I don't think I should have done that, and I regret a lot of that. I regret a great deal of that, honestly. I totally projected my own philosophical ideas into what had motivated him. I mean, I could have portrayed Woodham as sort of a jilted intellectual.
And maybe it would have been fine if he had projected his ideas quietly. But at a candlelight vigil for victims of the shooting that week, Justin made a speech where he called Luke Woodham his friend and said he, quote, went mad because of society. We, as a society, must change.
This was a time period where I remember watching the Hollywood shootout and when they were the bank robbery and how those guys were portrayed as sort of folk heroes in a certain kind of way. The Oklahoma City bombing had happened. And I had this sense that society itself was producing these monsters. And that if society didn't change, we would continue to produce monsters like Woodham or McVeigh or David Koresh or what have you. And I diagnosed that as a kind of not taking intellect seriously, that we took all kinds of other things seriously in our society, but we didn't take intellect seriously or something. And of course, this is obviously not what a town in profound grief needed to hear. And again, I look back on this with a great deal of regret and shame.
Justin remembers being invited to speak, but news reports at the time described him as disrupting the vigil. Today, it's hard to hear Justin's argument at the time without thinking of all the mass murderers and all the manifestos that have come since. It's hard to hear about Luke Woodham without thinking about Elliot Rodger, who killed 6 people in 2014. He left communiques framing himself as the victim of a world that denied him what he deserved. And certain corners of the internet painted him as a hero. Some people still do.
I was a traumatized young person trying to cope with what I was dealing with as well. So it might explain to some degree what I said and did, but it certainly doesn't justify it.
In the days after the shooting, the entire town was reeling and scared. People thought it might happen again, and they began to want a better answer than it was a disgruntled boyfriend-girlfriend thing, or we live in a society. There had to be something more behind this.
In the days after the shooting, you could start hearing the first rumors of conspiracy, that there was some kind of conspiracy. The first version of it was this was somehow like Dixie Mafia related. And then the next iteration I heard was that there was some group of people at the school called The Group. Like, I don't know, capital T, capital G, The Group. And that The Group was somehow maybe tied to devil worship, that there was a devil worshiping entity called The Group. And again, this is happening over the course of just a few days. It was right after that I could begin to see friends of mine being interrogated by the police. They'd be sort of being picked off and then one by one interrogating by the police. And at that moment, I began to realize, hold on, something's happening.
Justin had made 2 crucial errors. He had spoken on behalf of Luke Woodham at the vigil, and he was just a little bit different. Put those 2 things together in a town dealing with a crime of a type it has never experienced before, and you might have yourselves a suspect.
So the shooting happened on a Wednesday. We all went back to school on a Monday, if you could believe that. And as soon as I arrived back on campus, I was escorted to the office, held there. I wasn't allowed to leave the office. They had an armed guard in there with me the whole time. I was escorted off campus by an armed guard.
According to news reports at the time, Justin was suspended for what he did at the vigil.
I was at home. It was sometime in the evening time when the police came. I remember my mom getting pretty hysterical and my dad sort of just trying to talk to the police, being like, what's going on? Can you tell me, just trying to get information about what's happening. Yeah, I remember coming out of my room. I don't know what I was doing at the time, but coming out of my room and they turned me around and handcuffed me and told me I was charged with a conspiracy to commit murder. They put handcuffs on me and took me out to the car. I got booked in, and I remember coming in, and there were the other guys that had been arrested were all in the same room. And I remember thinking, what's going on? And we all ask ourselves the same question. What's happening? What's going on? What is this all about? What did you get charged with? Where are your papers? So it was just a bunch of, at least I was 16 at the time, just teenagers trying to sort out what in the world was happening.
Along with Justin, 4 other high schoolers and 1 college student named Grant Boyette were arrested. Justin was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. It's a charge that can come with a sentence of up to 20 years in prison.
But I think the feelings were just confusion and shock and fear and, I don't know, it's like the emotional equivalent of when you're walking down the stairs and you miss a stair and you start falling. It's like that. It was a real nightmare.
Justin's parents got him a lawyer, and he pled not guilty. And it's at this point, as the teenagers are being held and questioned pre-trial, that the story about a shadowy group at school begins to take shape. 2 of the accused conspirators told police about a cult-like group, and that Grant Boyette, the college student, was in charge.
I can say that I knew Grant, but, if you were to look at him, he would look sort of like a, Mormon missionary a little bit.
I looked at a couple of photos from the newspapers at the time. That tracks. The idea of a sinister cabal of young men who hated the world was basically catnip to the public, and the investigators and the media ran with it.
There was a moment in the juvenile proceedings where I came in and my lawyers were visibly angry at me, and I was like, oh God, what have I done? And they're like, what the fuck is the croth? And I was like, the what? And they're like, the croth. And it was a moment where one of the paralegals or one of the other lawyers, he looked at my lawyer and he let out a sigh of relief. And I was like, what's going on, guys? They say you're part of a satanic group called the Croth.
The shooting had been a national story from day one, but the story of the alleged teenage cult that led to it meant that it stayed in the news.
Clearly, the 7 students were friends. Perhaps they even qualified as a clique, with at least some of them sharing an unusual interest in Nietzsche and Latin. Now, the police in the suburb east of Jackson have said that the students were also co-conspirators in a plot to kill fellow students at Pearl High School.
Jackson adolescent counselor Paul Davey said teens who became involved in satanic and cult-like activity often think and act differently from others their age.
Woodham and the 6 alleged co-conspirators have been described as weird and highly intelligent.
School officials and students said the accused students liked to eat lunch together and spend free time with one another. Some of them apparently had a penchant for wearing black clothing.
I do remember Luke being interested in Nietzsche. The only thing worse than Nietzsche is a 16-year-old boy reading Nietzsche. But the common idea was you all knew this guy. You must have had something to do with it.
Given all this so-called evidence the papers were uncovering, it was not hard to fit Justin and the others into the typical profile of the teen Satanist that had been drilled into everybody's brains over the past 2 decades.
I think 2 counties over, they found some animal bones off of a hiking trail. And I think I remember when I was listening to some of the transcripts, one young girl had come to the detectives because she had seen clouds form the shape of a skull.
But there's a world where this whole debacle over a supposed satanic group could have never really blown up. Really, where people just paid a little bit more attention to what Luke Woodham actually said. In his initial confession, he was pretty clear about his motivations and mindset. He resented his mother, Mary, and he resented his ex-girlfriend, Christina. And you can hear all this in the tape of that confession, courtesy of WLBT.
Then she dumped me again. And ever since then, I've never been the same. And
when was this?
That was last year, like a week before Thanksgiving.
Wow.
And you can ask anybody at school. They'll tell you I really hated the world. Outwardly just walked around like I was going to do what happened in school. That's what it looked like.
Throughout this nearly 18-minute-long video, the most Satan-adjacent things Luke Woodham mentions are a role-playing game and wanting to see an Ozzy Osbourne concert. Why was misogyny not enough of a motive to accept? Why did Satan need to be part of the story? In just a handful of years, school shootings have gone from being an outlier to an existential threat, especially after Columbine, which at the time was the deadliest school shooting in American history, with 13 victims, although that superlative has since been passed many times. In the aftermath of Columbine, frightened parents and fear-mongering media blamed culprits ranging from Marilyn Manson to the Gothic movement. But what people were a little slower to point out was that the Columbine massacre was facilitated largely by Colorado gun laws that made it extremely easy for a teenager to buy an assault weapon at a gun show, or more broadly, by the laxity of American gun laws in general. In this case, in Pearl, Mississippi, there was a similar kind of impulse, and blaming some kind of outside influence is easier than looking at ourselves. On a small scale, this kind of magical thinking can be what we need to get through the days and weeks after a tragedy. But on a larger scale, and certainly on a national scale, it's also a way for us to refuse to learn whatever lessons these horrific experiences can possibly teach us. We just kind of throw up our hands and say that maybe some people are just born evil, and there's nothing we can do, except wait for the next one. And yet, there's always been a pattern. Young white males living in a culture of emotional repression and weaponized misogyny, without easy access to mental health resources, but with very easy access to guns. In the case of Pearl, Mississippi, those motives were visible from day one, just as they were in so many of the cases that followed it. But we can't learn from the things we're not looking for.
There was an idea that they hadn't caught everybody, or that the parents of there were some adults who were the real pullers of the strings and the real Satanists, and they were going to train another group of kids to do something. Or again, you hear these rumors sort of being, and they get back to you, and you're like, are my parents going to be arrested? And if they get arrested, what am I going to do? What are my brother and I going to do? Yeah, well, you have these sort of constant lingering fears.
The thing is, even if Luke Woodham wasn't a teen Satanist, he was still a teenager who needed help from adults. Woodham wrote in his diary, which later became court evidence, about gleefully torturing and killing a dog. And in a 9th grade writing assignment, he wrote about wanting to kill all of his teachers and to torture the principal to death. But no one had intervened then. So what good was the teen Satanist profile anyway?
There were certainly people. I heard people saying they were like combing the forests looking for evidence of Satanists, and they would find a heap of bones in the woods, and they were like, "Oh, look, the Satanists have been here," but it was just like a city dump, and there was like chicken bones. But confirmation bias is a hell of a thing. We're all guilty of it. We all guilty of confirmation bias. And it's very difficult in a small town, once there's social momentum and there's a trusted institution like the police saying to the entire community that a conspiracy of Satanists has done this crime, well, there's every reason to turn your confirmation bias on and go looking for things, especially if you think your kids aren't safe. The mind runs wild. Pearl was a deeply religious community. There was tons and tons of churches, this so-called buckle of the Bible Belt. And for deeply religious people, the devil is just as real as God. The devil, hell is just as real. Demons are just as real. And if you are told by law enforcement that spiritual warfare is playing itself out in your community, and you're hearing it from the pulpit and hearing it from the police department, and hearing it from teachers, who are they to stand up and say, no, it's not?
The case building against Justin and his alleged co-conspirators in the court of public opinion was like a bingo sheet of every fear-mongering conservative trope you can think of. They were accused of anti-Christianity, communism, summoning demons, and investigators even said the group planned to take over the high school and then escape to Cuba.
Judge Goza was a judge very much driven by evidence. What is the actual tangible evidence that there was a satanic conspiracy or any kind of conspiracy? And I remember being in the courtroom when he would, really just, pound the gavels. It's a metaphor, but in some sense true. Just demanding evidence. And, the evidence would always be highly circumstantial, or we have testimony from these kids, or we have this, we have that. And then when it came down to asking for it, it never appeared.
As the investigations progressed, Luke Woodham began accusing his older friend, Grant Boyette, of indeed being a Satanist, and of trying to get Luke to be one too. Luke testified about drawing pentagrams and casting satanic spells with Grant, and he also testified that Grant said Satan was his father and wanted Luke to do great things, and that Grant was sending demons and apparitions that were encouraging Luke to kill. In fact, when Luke Woodham stood trial for the shooting, his defense team built their argument on his toxic relationship with Grant Boyette. The defense framed Woodham as an unpopular, depressed kid who fell under the thrall of a charismatic older guy who preached the power of Satan. His lawyers argued that Woodham could not be responsible and asked the jury to name Woodham not guilty by reason of insanity. But even this defense didn't go so far as invoking the Croth, or any kind of conspiracy larger than these two young men.
Any last words? God bless you all.
That's all Luke Woodham had to say as he left the courthouse as a convicted murderer. 12 jurors found him guilty in the stabbing death of his 50-year-old mother, Mary. He still faces trial for the shooting deaths of Christina Menifee and Lydia Dew at Pearl High School that same day. Friday morning, attorneys...
In June 1998, Luke Woodham was found guilty. He received 3 life sentences, one for each of the women he murdered, and 20 years each for 7 charges of aggravated assault. Grant Boyette was convicted of conspiracy in 2000 for his clear role in encouraging Woodham to violence. As for Justin and the 4 others, the conspiracy charges against them were dropped a month after Woodham's conviction, in July 1998, nearly a year and a half after the shooting. Another charge against Justin was dropped later that year.
The actual satanic conspiracy element, I think, had been abandoned by the prosecution. Now, Luke still maintained that Grant had control of him through demonic influence and something like that. There was some talk of demons in the trial and things like that, but the actual occult conspiracy theory basically evaporated. Ultimately, when it came down to me, I saw the prosecution for the last time in my lawyer's office, and they were like, good luck. And I remember thinking that evening, I'm like, good luck. Like, what do I do now? Everyone thinks I'm a devil-worshipping murderer.
The charges had been dropped, but the court of public opinion wasn't so sure.
It was just like, you got to figure out what to do with your life. I wasn't allowed to go back to school. No school would take me, so I had to ultimately go through a kind of correspondence program. Then I kind of drifted for a while. People shot at our house when I was in jail. They called them all kinds of names. You can imagine in a small town, people go grocery shopping, and my mom goes grocery shopping, and, people are leering at her and calling her names and stuff. My dad eventually had to leave, and for a while it was just my brother and I kind of holding the family together. My brother and I were like, how do we keep this house? How do we not be homeless? And eventually I ended up homeless. I slipped into despair, and which I think was very reasonable at the time. I had no prospects. I had hard to get a job. And real despair set in the years that followed. Real despair, suicidal despair.
For a while, this was a story Justin didn't want to return to, but he also couldn't escape it.
Yeah, and then I began to see other cases where it would happen, and it was like, hold on, this is bigger. And I think at that time I read, it was around the same time I read The Crucible. Okay, the witch trials. This is sounding similar. And then I just kept digging. And I'm probably one of the few people outside of hardcore medievalists who actively reads inquisitorial manuals. And that kind of, at some level, helped to kickstart an interest in the world of the esoteric or the world of the occult. And ultimately, I decided to become an academic because I wanted to really systematically understand this.
Justin's experience exploded his entire life. Nothing could ever be the same again. On the other hand, the effect it had for him was to make him curious about the thing he had been accused of being, a cultist, someone who was interested in secret religious rituals and in holding the power that ancient knowledge entitled him to. And the kid from Pearl is now Dr. Justin Sledge.
I'm an expert in Western esotericism, and I am the host of the popular YouTube channel Esoterica. So Western esotericism is a interdisciplinary academic field that studies sort of a grab bag of what the most important scholar in the field is called rejected knowledge. So this would be things like alchemy, astrology, mysticism, magic, the occult, Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism.
For Justin, being accused of something that he had nothing to do with based on the prejudices of adults seems to have inspired him to become a better kind of adult.
I get emails from concerned parents saying, hey, I found my kid's diary and it has all these kind of weird symbols in it. Is my kid a Satanist? And I was like, hey, look, give me a call. I'm happy to talk to you. I would far rather a detective working on a strange case with a bunch of weird symbols shoot me an email and say, hey, what the hell is this? Than it to be a bunch of pseudo-experts running around. There's something gruesome, not just about the crime that occurred that day, which took the lives of several people, but also the families of those people being told that some satanic cult was responsible for what had happened to their children. And then ultimately that just evaporated. And I don't know that they were ever told the truth or apologized to or whatever. So it's very important to say, yeah, the Satanic Panic did have a pretty horrifying negative influence on my life, but that's a pale shadow to be cast compared to the heinous crime that was committed by Luke Woodham that day.
What Justin's experience taught him, and what it can teach us, is that everything changes when the brilliant light of knowledge fills a darkened room. Because legends look scary when they lurk in the shadows. And if we're not careful, those legends can be used to incite moral panics and to drive those panics toward members of a community who are primed to be scapegoated by moral entrepreneurs and by those who are genuinely afraid. But when you choose to see history as something that can be scary, but is also complicated and full of humanity and full of people similar to ourselves, and who can in fact teach us more about ourselves, then what seems like a monster in the darkness is revealed in the light of day to be just another teenager. Before we go, there is one more question I wanted to try to answer. What was the deal with the Croth, the supposed name of the satanic cult? Where did that even come from?
My lawyers were like visibly angry at me. And I was like, oh God, what have I done? And they're like, what the fuck is the Croth? And I was like, the what?
This is one of those funny little details embedded in these larger and tragic Satanic Panic stories that always sticks out to me. Students, investigators, media outlets, all of them dedicated time to trying to figure out what the Croth was, where it came from, and what it meant. Because remember, for a while, the Croth was supposed to be the prosecutor's smoking gun. And ultimately, all it turned out to be was a whole lot of smoke.
I remember knowing there was a Star Wars role-playing game being played by some people at the high school, and it's hilarious to say it now, but I remember thinking, like, how dorky is that? Again, this is coming from the kid playing Dungeons & Dragons. Like, oh, it's one thing to be into Dungeons & Dragons. It's another thing to be into Dungeons & Dragons and sci-fi, God forbid.
As it turned out, Grant Boyette did play a Star Wars-themed role-playing game. I know, pretty satanic.
The Croth internet website is the gateway to the imaginary planet Croth, which hosts the game Dungeons & Dragons. The role-playing game Dragon Spawn uses Croth as a place reference. Butch John, the Jackson Clarion Ledger.
Clarion Ledger reporters tracked down the creator of that site. It turned out to be some guy named Jeff who lived in Colorado Springs. He was a computer analyst and an ordained minister. Croth, he said, sounds like Earth. It's a totally made-up name. Jeff told the paper, "If you're looking for a scapegoat, I'm not it." Thank you for listening to The Devil You Know. Our producer is Mary Steffenhagen. Fact-checking by Catherine Barner. Production assistance by Nicole Ortiz. Thanks to Jake Howitt for voice coaching. I've been your host, Sarah Marshall. Our sound designer is Evan Kelly. Roshni Nair is our coordinating producer. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is manager of growth for CBC Podcasts. Arif Noorani is director of CBC Podcasts.